Abbott soon split with his 4 fellow jailbreakers, who were quickly caught through their own stupidity, one in a Footscray pub after starting a drunken brawl because a fellow drinker refused to believe he was an escapee. That feat started the Abbott legend, part of which was the assertion that he deliberately taunted police by sending postcards to them while on the run. I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. We're going to revisit the story of a bloke called Brenden James Abbott, alias the Postcard Bandit. The story of the Postcard Bandit is back in the zeitgeist because in recent weeks we've had a book republished, and an updated book, new title, new look, new pictures, new chapters. It's been republished by major publisher, Allen and Unwin, and not one but 2 works of film. One is a drama series that's being screened on a streamer. It's called Run, and the other one is a most excellent 2-part doco called The Postcard Bandit, made by Warner Brothers. And there's a lot of raps, particularly on the doco. So clearly it's time to take another look at the life and crimes of Brendan Abbott, in case people forget who he was or a younger generation didn't know about him at all. Abbott was intelligent, resourceful, self-reliant. He had technical flair sharpened by observation and a hunger to learn. The kid from Broadmeadows could have mastered any legitimate trade and built up a business that would have made him a wealthy man. But he didn't. Like Russell Cox and Ray, Chuck and Billy the Texan Longley and all the rest of the gunmen in a line all the way back to the bushranger days of Ben Hall and Ned Kelly, young Brendan Abbott took the wrong turn. Abbott turned 64 this May. He's sitting in a high security prison cell in Casuarina Prison in Western Australia. If and when he leaves prison in 2028 after serving a longer sentence than many murderers do, he'll hit retirement age with no more than the notoriety that comes with being one of the most prolific robbers and ingenious escape artists in Australian crime history. That is, of course, unless he has something stashed away, which personally I doubt, because they never seem to. But if there's one crook who just might have worked out a way to game the system, it might be Brendan Abbott. In Australia, only the enigmatic and deadly Russell Cox, alias Mad Dog Cox, matches or overshadows Abbott's deeds as a jailbreaker and elusive fugitive. But it's unlikely that even Cox the Fox robbed more banks of more cash than Abbott did. Abbott was the one who became the shape-shifting interstate raider, catchily, but inaccurately, dubbed the Postcard Bandit. Abbott is something like the legendary American bank robber and escaper Slick Willie Sutton, who entered folklore, a bit like the 1930s fugitive John Dillinger, as the ultimate repeat offender. Asked why he kept robbing banks, Sutton allegedly retorted, "Because that's where the money is." It's a killer line that has entered the language, although Sutton insisted later that a New York crime reporter made it up, which is entirely possible. Abbott pulled dozens of robberies, but the same as with Slick Willie and John Dillinger and others, his exploits were polished in the retelling. Still, Abbott was credited with the biggest robberies in each of 3 states during the 1,948 days that he was on the run, a period of 5 years and 4 months, only slightly less time than World War II took, and a time in which maybe 40 strikingly similar bank robberies went unsolved from Perth to Queensland. Those 5 years outside the law don't include the 6 months that the young Abbott had spent on the loose after slipping out of a suburban police interview room in Perth in December 1986. Those 5 years outside the law also don't include the 6 months that the older Abbott spent on the run after staging a prison break in Queensland in 1997 that made him public enemy number one for police, prison bosses and politicians in the Sunshine State. It was a case of here one day, gone the next. The fact that he left a prison transfer form filled in his empty cell the night that he went through the window didn't make him popular with the authorities. Abbott's escape crew, there were 4 others with him, used smuggled diamond wire to cut bars through at the Sir David Longland Correctional Centre outside Brisbane before a conspirator outside, a very young ex-prisoner called Brendan Abbott, threw bolt cutters over the perimeter fence and shot up the armoured perimeter guard vehicle with an assault rifle. That rather helped the escapers' cause. Abbott soon split with his 4 fellow jailbreakers, who were quickly caught through their own stupidity. One, can you believe this, in a Footscray pub after starting a drunken brawl because a fellow drinker refused to believe he was an escapee. The resulting headline suggested that it was the gang with one brain. The only brain was Abbott, and he'd split from the bunch almost as soon as they got out of prison in Queensland. But Abbott, meanwhile, did stick loyally to the 19-year-old Brendan Abbott, the young guy who'd thrown in the bolt cutters and produced, I think, 2 or 3 guns and shot up the armoured 4-wheel drive that was patrolling the perimeter, because without that they could never have got out. And Abbott did the right thing and sort of stuck with this rather loose kid. You can imagine he was rather loose that he would do such a thing. He's out of jail, he's free, he could just, get a job or go surfing or something, but no, he has to get guns and break 5 dangerous men out of jail. It would seem to be a fairly rash thing to do. So Abbott sticks with him. But it turns out that Abbott's concept of honour among thieves was probably a mistake. Abbott might have stayed in smoke, on the loose, indefinitely. He could even have used one of his many forged identities to escape overseas, because he'd done that before. He'd gone for holidays overseas with fake passports and stuff. He was very good. But the reckless and feckless Brendan Abbott started a shootout with unsuspecting police at Box Hill while trying to score heroin. That is Box Hill in Melbourne. Now, the fugitive pair at this stage had set up a safe house in Fitzroy. They managed to rent a property in Fitzroy for 6 months or something. It was in not a suburban street with nosy neighbours. It was sort of in a busy place in a bit of light industrial. So it was the perfect spot for them to be, because escapers like Abbott know that the worst place to try and live is in a quiet suburban street, because the neighbours are always nosy and they always wonder what you're up to and watch what you're driving and watch when you come home and all that sort of stuff. It was far better to rent a place in the inner burbs, next door to a laundromat or whatever it might be. But Bereshon developed a taste for heroin. He went out to Box Hill foolishly to score heroin from Vietnamese dealers. And while he was there, with a pistol in his bum bag, a couple of uniformed coppers that were just local coppers asked him who he was and all the rest of it, as they did with people buying drugs. And he panicked. He pulled out his pistol and he shot one of the police. The policeman survived, but he shot him in the legs. It wasn't good. After that, Abbott was suddenly on the back foot, because suddenly these wanted men aren't just wanted in the abstract. They're actually wanted in Melbourne for shooting at police. Very bad move. And it was only a matter of time before the police would grab them both in Darwin. And they did that because they were able to follow the clues that the clumsy young Bereshon and his new stripper girlfriend, Michelle, left everywhere they went. Bereshon not only developed a taste for heroin, but he got extremely keen on a stripper called Michelle who he thought should travel with them, which was a bit of a mixed blessing. It did turn 2 people into 3 people, which is good, but it did have its downside because, she would tend to ring up friends or whatever it might be. So in the end, Brendan Abbott was brought undone by others, as he eventually had been during his 5-year bank robbery campaign back in the 1990s. That was when he nailed the tactic of dropping in through the roof to surprise bank staff just before opening time, when cash drawers were full and customers hadn't yet come inside. The first of many times Abbott used that technique was in the Belmont branch of the Commonwealth Bank in Perth way back in May 1987, in his first iteration as an armed robber. That was around the time of his 25th birthday. Apart from the novel entry point via the ceiling, the robbery stood out because one of the bank tellers was the tough West Coast Eagles player Carl Langdon. He had the really bottle blonde hair and he's a very tough guy. And there he was in the bank in a shirt that Abbott ridiculed rather gently later for being pink. He said, bloody Carl Langdon was there in a pink shirt, which he found quite amusing. I don't think Carl Langdon found it amusing because he ended up with a pistol in his face. The Belmont job, the Commonwealth Bank in Belmont in Perth, in 1987, it ran to more than $112,000 that Abbott and a co-offender got away with. It was a state record bank haul. Within weeks, this is back in the 80s, he was arrested at Perth Airport returning from the north of the state. Oddly, Abbott noted later, the $32,000 cash that he'd left in a bag in a vehicle in Port Hedland had shrunk to $16,000 by the time a prosecutor raised it in the trial that ended up convicting him and landing him in the notorious Fremantle prison for his first serious sentence. Remarkably, a detective on the case had mentioned it to a Port Hedland local. He said something like, I bet you didn't realise that there was 32 grand in that ute, and the bull terrier tied up next to it would have licked you to death. It wasn't a problem. However, by the time the case got to court later, it had mysteriously halved. Amazing. Shrinking money. Abbott learnt from that job. He learnt that you couldn't necessarily trust investigators. The getaway driver for that robbery, Peter Levens, informed his way to a 9-month minimum. And Abbott's longtime girlfriend, Jackie Lord, this was a girl that he'd known since they were teenagers. She also cut a sweet deal that left her ex-lover, Abbott, facing a 12-year sentence in the stinking stone cells of the notorious Fremantle prison. It was a very bad old place. It was very old and was sort of a throwback to the convict era. Abbott's answer to that, to a 12-year sentence, was to get a job in the prison tailor's shop, the tailoring shop. He was a quick learner and he befriended the nice tailor who was in charge, and he worked out that if he got some blue material, which he was able to get, he could fabricate blue overalls that looked very much like the prison officers' uniforms, which was very useful. This was a prop that allowed him to lead a late-night escape across the prison rooftops on November the 24th, 1989. That feat started the Abbott legend, part of which was the assertion that he deliberately taunted police by sending postcards to them while on the run. Now, it's a great story, the postcard story, and it's given rise to the name of our documentary that's out now, and it's given rise to the title of the reissued book, which originally called The Australian Outlaw, or Australian Outlaw, now retitled The Postcard Bandit. It's become part of the Australian language. But sadly, the postcard story was a fabrication based on the fact that police found a roll of film left in a car by Abbott and his fellow Fremantle escaper, Aaron Reynolds. And when the police developed that roll of film, they saw one frame of Reynolds standing outside a Western Australian country police station. So the two scallywags on the run, the fugitives, Abbott's got Reynolds to stand outside the, I think, Dwelling Up. It's a town over there in the wheat belt. Stand there, and he took a photo of him. And they left the roll of film in the car, and the coppers got the film later and developed it. So that's how it sort of started. There were other holiday snaps of the fugitive pair, but they weren't sent to the police or sent to anybody. These snaps they took when they took a tour bus. The two escapees, very wisely, because Abbott was smart, they posed as tourists and they bought tickets on a tour bus. They didn't go to see the penguins at Phillip Island, but they went to Uluru and all those sort of good things. And they pelled up with a male Japanese tourist. So you had these two Aussies in sunglasses and hats, happy chappies, with a very friendly Japanese tourist, and they travelled as a threesome. And that, of course, didn't make them look like desperate robbers on the run. They just looked like, you know, suburban boys having a week off in the bus tour. However, when these pictures were eventually found by the police in some other raid, whenever, they were subsequently developed, and the police leaked them to a magazine later on that cynically and dishonestly mischaracterised them as postcards. They never were postcards. They were just holiday snaps, which weren't even developed by the crooks. The police had developed them, and they were used in that way. And it was really a fabrication done with the cooperation of the police to draw attention to these guys. Not that it really matters. I don't suppose the police owe armed robbers and fugitives the truth, but anyway. Abbott's exploits were always going to be aired, given his sheer audacity. But the credit for telling the true story behind the legend belongs to a journalist and author now known as Abe Madison. More than 20 years ago, when the then young writer or reporter was using his adoptive name, Derek Pedley, he gained Abbott's trust and built contacts among Abbott's family members, friends and former lovers. After his first book, No Fixed Address, he wrote a more detailed and compelling account of Abbott's life, which was published in 2006, 20 years ago, as Australian Outlaw. This was followed by a mini-series starring the late Tom Long as Abbott. It was not a bad series, pretty watchable. Tom Long, the nice young actor that really was well known through Sea Change and other things, and The Dish, he didn't really look like Abbott as such, but he did have a rather friendly face, which helped. And the music, the signature music in that series was the great Australian crawl song, Don't Be So Reckless, or Reckless brackets, Don't Be So. And the key line in that is, throw down your guns, don't be so reckless. And that would be used over and over in that series, and it was very effective. Now, full disclosure, because we're very ethical here at Life and Crimes, I, that is Andrew Rule, edited and published that 2006 version of Australian Outlaw. And it's an updated version of that book, which was relaunched recently, in recent weeks, by Allen and Unwin, the publishers, under the title, the inevitable title, The Postcard Bandit. Now, this new look book takes in later aspects of Abbott's life and crimes and subsequent prison sentences and escapes. It coincides with the release of the new drama series named Run and a 2-hour documentary, which of course is also called The Postcard Bandit. So regardless of that being a fabrication, it is now part of the language, and that's it. The book, the updated book, and the films, the documentary and the drama, mark a return to the spotlight for the long-term prisoner now cooling his heels in Casuarina prison, contemplating an exciting but ultimately wasted life. It's been a big year for his biographer, Pedley alias Madison, who has charted the Abbott story so meticulously across more than 2 decades. In fact, close to a quarter of a century, really. Of course, listeners with long memories will recall that we spoke with Abe Madison, alias Derek Pedley, back in 2023 in an episode we called The Postcard Bandit and Me. And some of these stories we've been over before, but some we haven't. So there you go. Now, the journo now known as Abe Madison was born in May 1972, exactly 10 years after Brendan Abbott. There are other similarities, apart from being born in May. His mother, that is Abe Madison's mother, like Abbott's mother Thelma, had fallen pregnant as an unmarried teenager. But whereas Thelma Abbott, barely 16, married Brian Abbott and had 5 children in quick succession, of which Brendan was the third, Perth girl Joy Madison had no choice but to give up the baby that she called Abraham. And that baby was subsequently raised as Derek Pedley by a kindly couple who lived in country Western Australia. When young Derek, as he was called then, found out the truth about his origins at the age of 15, it rocked him profoundly. The boy was energetic and creative, and he later forged a successful career as a reporter. But behind the facade he presented to the world, he drank heavily and he ate far too much. And he did that to ease the sort of psychic pain that he felt, which is not uncommon with adopted boys particularly, I think. He's a tall man, and as a troubled youngster in his 20s, he reached weights of up to 130 kilograms because he used to drink bourbon for breakfast, beer for lunch and so on. He did a lot of drinking. And he smoked a lot of weed. He told me the other day that for years he doesn't think he was not stoned at work, and yet he managed to function somehow. Abe Madison, the artist formerly known as Derek Pedley, would eventually tell his own story in his moving memoir, Crazy Bastard, but that came much later, just a few years ago. His first books were, of course, about Brendan Abbott, and the updated version, launched the other day, traces the Postcard Bandit story from Broadmeadows in the 1960s to Perth's maximum security prison in the 2020s, and everything in between. It's part non-fiction thriller, part biography, and part morality tale. It underlines the fact that jails are full of damaged people doomed to be there by circumstances of birth and upbringing, but that among them are a few who strayed from what otherwise might have been successful lives in the legitimate world. Brenden James Abbott wasn't earmarked from birth to a life of crime. To a large extent, he chose that path instead of using the intelligence he was born with to succeed in some other way. His early choices landed him in prison. Then he doubled down and compounded his mistake by using his brain to break out of jail, a move guaranteeing that he would inevitably be hunted down when he ran out of hiding places. His success as a robber and escaper ensured his failure as a man, as a father, as a brother, and as a son. In the end, Brendan Abbott's life has been wasted, spent sentenced to more years inside than anyone not actually convicted of murder. For the rest of us, of course, it makes a good tale, which is why it's been told before and it's being told again, on the page and on the screen. There's a postscript to this story that's just come up. His fellow escaper, Brendan Bereshon, the man who shot the policeman at Box Hill all those years ago, the man who was on the run with Abbott, and they were the 2 most wanted men in the country for months. Apparently he didn't want to attract attention when this book was relaunched recently, and he kept a low profile. But I understand that he's involved heavily in running a Melbourne gymnasium, which is interesting. So somewhere out there in the burbs, if you're going to a gym, you might see a fairly hard-looking, lean, fit-looking bloke and wonder if there's something vaguely familiar about his name. It's Brendan Bereshon, jailbreaker, robber, gunman and cop shooter. Not a cop killer, just a cop shooter. And probably a reformed character, let's hope. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. For my columns, features and more, go to heraldsun.com.au/Andrew Rule, one word. For advertising inquiries, go to newspodcastssold@news.com.au. That is all one word, newspodcastssold. And if you want further information about this episode, links are in the description.